And I suppose some apologies in advance in case some events beyond my control occur. So I want to apologise in advance if my children come into the room, if the dogs start barking, if my internet connection goes. They're all things that I have absolutely no control over. So I'm just going to, do my best to get through the slides, and I'll stop at 10 and we'll have some questions at the end. So what I want to talk about is obviously adverse childhood experiences, and I want to talk about it in terms of the research that we've done in applied psychology, and then maybe some critical questions around ACEs. And there are people who have been quite vocal in their criticism in terms of how we think about ACEs, and I want to address some of that as well. I'm also conscious as well, from people who registered for the event, that there's quite a mix of people who tuned into the webinar this evening. So, most of you are from a psychology background, but there are also people who won't have psychology as their background. So what I've tried to do is try to start with some of kind of the basics and get into the research a little bit more after that. So in terms of trauma and thinking about trauma and what are ACEs, when we think about trauma and adverse childhood experiences for me is any adversity that a child experiences. And I'll get into that a little bit more in terms of what that actually means and what that looks like. And when we think about psychological trauma, it can occur at an individual level, it can occur at a group level, and it can occur across whole communities. So we have single incident traumas. So these are often once-off events. They are unexpected and overwhelming. You have complex and developmental trauma. And those two terms are a little bit overlapping. They tend to relate to quite chronic trauma that occurs in the early years of a child's life, and that trauma mostly occurs within the context of relationships that they have. So it makes it much more complicated and much more complex. Then we have the intergenerational trauma, which is living with trauma survivors. And the impact of that can't be underestimated. Apologies to those of you who've heard my escalator story before, but for those who haven't, I give an example of the power of intergenerational trauma. So I have two little children, and my oldest child is frightened of escalators. And I was in a supermarket one day with my mother and my children, and my daughter was afraid to go on the escalator, and we held hands and we got on and we jumped off the top. And my mother said, "Oh, what's that about?" And I said, "Oh, poor little Sarah's frightened of escalators, but it's my fault because I'm frightened of escalators, so I know where it came from." And then my mother informed me that she was frightened of escalators, but she knew why. So a year before I was born, my grandmother died. I never met her. And a couple of years before that, she had gone to a Roche stores in Limerick, and she saw a small child fall on an escalator. And that child's hair and scalp got pulled out. And she went home and she told all her children that story. And then obviously, my mother went on and she had her own children, and she passed on that fear of escalators on to us, and then we've passed it on. So I suppose in terms of thinking about the impact of the intergenerational stuff, so something that happened to a woman in 1973 has impacted on my child in 2020. So you have to think about, in terms of children and families, what other things have gone on that people are not even aware about, but that they carry in their behaviors, and that does have an impact on children. And then you have historical trauma. So that's your child sexual abuse in residential schools. Ireland has had a long history of historical trauma. We're still dealing with it. There are still issues coming up in relation to things that have happened in the past. And the experience of immigrants, refugees, marginalized groups, and ethnic minorities. You cannot talk about psychological trauma without talking about the impact of stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination on community groups. Our own ethnic minority group is the travelling community, and the travelling community experiences significant levels of trauma. There are very high levels of suicide, multiple deaths, and then those experiences are compounded by racism and prejudice. So in terms of thinking about the types of traumas, then there's bullying, there's poverty, We know that poverty has a detrimental impact on mental health and physical health and later life outcomes, peer rejection and having no friends, experiencing racism, death, multiple and traumatic losses, community violence, being a witness to community violence, experiencing food scarcity, experience of the care system can be very difficult for many children, having a poor academic performance. So people mightn't think about education as being a traumatic experience, but for many people, it can be. We know that education is a huge protective factor for young people, but there are many children who find it really difficult when they're in school, and there are some schools who find it very difficult to hold some children. And when those children become disengaged from school, it puts them at much higher risk for negative life outcomes. And also there's the living in an unsafe environment can be a place where multiple traumas can happen. And so in terms of thinking about what's happening then, so if you think about children and their exposure to stress, obviously there's different types of stress. There's good stress and there's bad stress. We all need a little bit of stress because it can help build resilience, it can help facilitate problem solving. And then there's bad stress. Bad stress is really often unpleasant things and too much of it happening at one time. And that's often termed as toxic stress. It's not new in psychology. I know that the ACEs conversation has brought it much more to maybe places where psychology hadn't gotten in a way that it should have. You know, the ACEs movement has become very big and very popular. Some people think that that's a negative thing. In fact, it's great because it means a lot of what we know in psychology is now being translated into other environments in a way it should have always have been done. So we know that too much stress is very bad for the body. We've known that's, you know, the term anesthetic load was coined in the 1970s or the 1960s perhaps, where researchers recognized that exposure to high levels of stress had wear and tear on the body and that it had an impact physically and mentally. So we know that when you're very stressed, there are stress hormones involved. You have, you know, your adrenaline is up, cortisol. There's decreased activity in your prefrontal cortex. So there's a loss of prefrontal regulation, and that's really important in terms of children because that's the area of the brain where you do your learning and your concentration. So if you have small people who turn up for school in the morning and they're living in situations where they're really frightened or they're really stressed or they're really worried, when they come into school, the part of the brain that should be online and fired up and ready to learn is not working as well as it should be because they're really, really stressed. And what do others see when that child arrives? They might see a child who's, you know, got challenging behavior or bad behavior, when actually the behavior is totally an appropriate response to their emotions. And unfortunately, they may be in a classroom with 30 other children. And the focus then is on the bad behavior rather than trying to understand what is this child trying to tell me? What is this anger about? What is this upset and disruption about? What is the problem here? What are they trying to tell us? And when I think about children who present, and I hate the term challenging behavior, I don't think children have challenging behavior. I think they're trying to tell us something in a different way and we just have to try and listen. So rather than focusing on challenging behavior, I always say, isn't it better to just step back and take a deep breath and be curious and say, I wonder what it is that's driving that behavior. I don't know if all of you watched The Unteachables on Virgin TV channel. It was about young people who are out of mainstream education, and I thought it was a really great example of an educational setting responding to the needs of the children and looking beyond the behavior. So, you know, as psychologists, we know that the first 1,000 days are really important. When the baby is born, you know, they have a huge amount of development. They by the age of about 3, and they have about 70% of what their brain will be when they're adults. And but those first 1,000 days are extremely important for them to form new synapses. And then by the time they're aged between 2 and 4, synaptic pruning can occur. So the brain can start to, shed some of the synapses that have developed that are no longer necessary. Unfortunately for some children, if they've lived with a lot of stress, toxic stress during that critical developmental period, that synaptic pruning may have happened a little bit earlier, or they might not have been given the same chances as other children might have had. So they're not operating from the same playing field. Other things I think that are important to think about is the role of endorphins, your natural pain and stress fighter. And sometimes when you're really, really stressed, you can have a reduction in endorphin production. And what does that mean? It means that there can be a decrease in your ability to self-soothe. And particularly if you think about older children and adolescents, one of the things that can, in the absence of being able to self-soothe, one of the things that can be very, I'm trying to think of the right word, it's not helpful, but adaptive. One of the adaptive things is, of course, the use of drugs and alcohol. Drugs and alcohol can help to self-soothe you. And what starts off as being something that's really helpful can become something really problematic. But we tend to have a lot of judgment about people who use drugs and alcohol without thinking about what it is that they get from that. Why are they choosing that substance? What does it provide them with that they can't manage without? And I think as psychologists, we need to do more to bring in people who are experiencing substance dependency, because we have a big issue in Ireland in relation to dual diagnosis services. The other thing in relation to endorphins is, how it affects people's ability to form attachments in relationships. And if you think in terms of psychology, if we want to do any good therapeutic work, that happens in the context of good attachments and good relationships. For people who've experienced, particularly young people who've experienced an awful lot of stress and a lot of trauma, it can take a long time to form a meaningful attachment or a meaningful relationship. And if you think about the demands that are on our services and the lack of resources, we often only offer people now 6 to 8 appointments, and that's it, they're gone. There are groups of children and young people where 6 and 8 appointments isn't even touching the sides of it. They might need to know you for a year before they would be able to build any kind of trusting relationship so that you can do some meaningful work. I have brought young people that I have worked with, absolutely wonderful young people, but they were experiencing a lot of challenges. And I've brought them to various different settings where they've had to do assessments and things like that. And they don't go back. They tell people to go fuck themselves. They do all that kind of stuff. And it's sad then to see the reaction of the services. So the services say, I can't engage with them. And I think, you haven't really understood and you haven't really tried, because you're trying to do too much in the absence of a relationship. The other hormone that's affected, of course, is dopamine, and that's very important for motivation. And you'll see this in some services, particularly in addiction services. They'll say, we've closed so-and-so's file because they weren't motivated to change. I've worked with people who have very serious dependency issues, and they don't have huge motivation. They find it really, really hard to do very small tasks. They absolutely want their lives to be better than they are now, but they do struggle to turn up for appointments on time. They struggle to remember appointments. They struggle to engage. And they're not bad people, they just struggle. And I think in terms of, if you take everything that we know from psychology and you put it all together, and you think about how we design services, it makes no sense to me that we're talking about people's motivation to change when we're talking about people who are in their boots. I think that if we take that psychological knowledge and use it to design services, we'll say, we understand that there's a group of our service users who really struggle to use our service. And we have to go the extra mile in order to support them. Sometimes they won't turn up for appointments, but what we have to do is support them and reach out and work with them to see if there's a way that we can make our service more accessible. I think we've gotten into a routine of the service suiting the service rather than the service thinking about the service users' needs. And I understand that that's a lot to do with resources, but I would rather work 100% with one person than 10% with 5. So that's my party political rant over. So I'm going to get into the research that we've done in applied psychology. So we've done some ACE research in a number of different areas: homelessness, residential addiction service, women in probation service in Limerick, juvenile justice, and with Frontline Workers. So that's a graph of, we looked at the ACE, the number of ACEs. And I suppose I'm working from the assumption that everybody who's tuned into the webinar is familiar with the 10 item ACEs from Felici et al.'s original study. So just in case, Felici et al. In 1998 conducted a very large study where he found that if adults had experienced a certain number, and most of the studies have shown that the clinical cutoff point is 4+. So if you've experienced 4 or more of the following items, then there was a dose-response relationship in terms of negative health outcomes, physical health, mental health, and other social outcomes. So we looked at the level of ACEs in the Cork-Simon community, and you can see on the graph there, the bars in yellow represent the service users of Cork-Simon and the levels of ACEs that they had. The average level of ACEs was 7 out of 10. And if you look at the green bars, that represents the original Felici et al. Study, which was a middle-class population. So you can see there's a significant difference between the lived experiences of people experiencing homelessness and the general population. And there can be a huge amount of judgment and bias about people who are experiencing homelessness. But I think if you think about it in terms of the path that they've walked, and I think that graph is very powerful to me, it says, you know, but for the grace of God, there go I. If I had walked in those shoes, what would my opportunities be? One of the things that, in terms of the demographic information that we took from the Cork-Simon service users, one of the things that was very shocking to me was the very low level of people who had gotten up as far as their Leaving Cert. So if you look here, only 12% of men and only 4.3% of the women in the Cork-Simon community had managed to get as far as their Leaving Cert. So when you think about risk and resilience factors in young people, and we have to do more to keep young people, especially young people who are experiencing adversity in education. And there's no point in saying that the young people are the problem. They're not. The experiences that they have make it difficult for them to engage. So we have to have educational settings that are able to hold those young people. I remember I worked with a very wise woman a long time ago, and she said to me, when we worked with very challenging young people, and she said to me, when they turn up here, you know, they might be angry and they might curse and they might shout and they might bang doors. But what they're actually asking you is 2 questions. Can you help me? And do you love me? And I think when children go into settings where they don't feel any warmth or any regard, and there's a huge focus on their behaviours, they disengage, and then that puts them at risk for very poor later outcomes. In a separate study that we did, we looked at, this was in conjunction with the School of Medicine in UCC and Dr. Anna Marie Naughton from HSE Social Inclusion in Cork. So we looked at 90 people who were experiencing homelessness in Cork City. So it was a range of different people. So there was people who were using emergency accommodation and people who were also rough sleeping. And in terms of their physical and health conditions, 70% of depression, 69% anxiety, 50% of dual diagnosis, 63% had self-harmed, almost 80% had suicidal thoughts, and 42% had attempted suicide. We didn't specifically ask about ACEs in this study, but what we did was we took being in care, were you ever in care, as being an indicator that somebody had experienced some form of ACEs. So 26% of the sample had been in care. That is, so their care leavers are disproportionately represented within the homelessness community and within prison populations as well. Those who had been in care were much more likely to be younger in terms of their age at homelessness, and much more likely to be diagnosed with depression. They were less likely to have their own GP, and they were less likely to be taking medications on a long-term basis. Many had very complex physical issues where they really needed to be taking medication, but adherence to medication was low. Again, I would argue that that is a failure on our part, perhaps, to have services designed to meet their needs. They were also asked about what works for them. So they said, you know, services being more flexible. Most people who are experiencing chronic chaos and challenges find it extremely difficult to be able to manage appointments and appointment-based services. When I did the Cork Simon A study, I presented as homeless myself, and I can tell you that from that experience, it is extremely busy being homeless. You have to fill out an endless amount of forms, and you have to go to multiple different appointments in multiple different settings. And that's just to try and get a roof over your head for the night. Never mind trying to attend to your physical health issues and your mental health issues as well. But when we give people who are experiencing homelessness appointments and they don't turn up, then we exclude them from our services without thinking about how difficult it is for them. Many of them said it would be much easier for them if they had on-site services. I know in Canada, one of the homeless organisations there has on all of their services on site. They have a little hospital there, so they have medical services and psychological services on site. One of the things that they said didn't work well for them was discrimination. They reported feeling stigma, shame, and discrimination within health services, and particularly in relation to addiction. I also had, we had a master's student, Pierce Adams, who conducted a qualitative study with people experiencing homelessness a number of years ago, and about 2 years ago, and Pierce interviewed people who were experiencing homelessness about their experiences of accessing mental health services. They felt stigmatized, they felt discriminated against. They didn't appreciate it when people constantly focused on their addiction. They felt that people failed to see their addiction as a response to their mental health needs, and that it was a constant focus on their behaviors. And there was one quote from one man that I found really poignant to read, and he had experienced very, very serious childhood sexual abuse, and he was in mental health services for a long time, and he said that he found it really hard when he went there, that all anybody wanted to talk about was whether he was taking his medication or not, and whether he was still using services. And he said that in all the years that he'd been using services, that nobody had ever asked him about what it was like to have experienced the level of childhood sexual abuse that he had. He goes on to describe that. I'm not going to do that because I'm conscious that I don't know you know, who's listening in and what their own experiences might be. So I don't think that would be safe to get into that. We also looked at ACE levels in addiction residential profile service, or an addiction residential service. We looked at the profile of ACEs there. That was in Tabor Group. What we found was that 44% of people had an objective mental health diagnosis. But when we asked people, did they feel they had a mental health issue, 92% said that they had. So 92% self-reported mental health disorders, primarily anxiety and depression. And they would have argued that that was there before their addiction. But it's very difficult because dual diagnosis is confounding the issue. So we still have the chicken and egg issue in relation to addiction and mental health. What came first and what came second? So a lot of people would still argue that addiction causes mental health. But there was a very large study by Kessler et al. In I think it was 2003, and I think it was updated after that, over 9,000 participants. And what they found was the onset for depression and anxiety was in late childhood, early adolescence, and the onset for substance use disorder was in late adolescence and early 20s. So I think we have to stop, you know, having those conversations with clients where we start saying, well, your mental health would be better if you dealt with your addiction, and start seeing them as part of the same package. What we found from that study was that for people who had ACE scores of higher than 4, they were higher reports of mental health disorders, higher reports of suicidal ideation, higher levels of imprisonment, and more treatment attempts. Now, the more treatment attempts is important in terms of thinking about services. Sometimes when people use services are disappointed if they feel that the person has failed. It hasn't worked, and they've discharged themselves, or they're you know, on a cycle where they keep coming back. And I think what's really important in terms of thinking about profiles of clients, if you're thinking about somebody who's experienced multiple adversity in childhood, they might need to come 4, 5, 6 times before it starts to work for them. So rather than seeing those as a failure, you should see them as a success if they've engaged, and frame it in that way. And that would be much more strengths-based and trauma-informed way. I remember working with a young man a long time ago who had significant issues, and he had always struggled to settle anywhere. He'd never really lasted more than a few days in any one location because his behavior was considered to be challenging, and he went to residential treatment, and I didn't think that he would last more than a week. And it was a 12-week program, and he stayed for 8 out of those 12 weeks, and then it broke down because he'd had a bad day, and he had to go home because he became aggressive. And when I met him afterwards, there was no one more disappointed about what had happened than he was. And I could see in his whole body how he was holding himself, and he was really down and he was really low. And when he sat down and we talked about it, I told him that I was really proud of him because he had stayed 8 out of 12 weeks. And that if that had been an exam, what percentage that would have been. And we were able to frame it as a success and then think about what had gone wrong and how we could change it in order for when he tried the next time. But there's a lot of pressure on services to produce outputs and KPIs, and that's a really challenging thing to do when you're talking about people, human beings. Some people will need to use a service several times before it works for them. And just because that happens, just because they have multiple treatment attempts, it's not a failure. That's a success that they keep coming back. So, you know, they were 4 times more likely to report thinking about suicide when compared to low ACE scores, 11 times more likely to report being incarcerated, and more likely to have a mental health diagnosis, more likely to have been diagnosed as clinically depressed, more likely to have self-reported depression compared to low ACE scores. So what we did in that particular one, Reagan Murphy in the School of Applied Psychology, and I looked at that data, and what we did was we divided it into those who scored 4 or more and those who scored under 4. And there was significant differences between those 2 groups. Similarly, with women who were in contact with the probation service, looked at their ACEs, significant levels of ACEs. They were much more likely to have grown up with domestic violence, much more likely to have grown up in a household where somebody had a mental illness, more likely to have grown up with substance dependence, 2.5 times more likely to have experienced physical abuse, more likely to have experienced verbal abuse, and more likely to have experienced childhood sexual abuse. We also looked at the profiles of young people who are in Garda Youth Diversion Projects. So these are young people who've come in contact with An Garda Síochána. So we didn't ask young people about their ACEs. That would be not a good thing to do. So what we did was we asked Garda Youth Diversion Project workers to think about the young people that they worked with and what they knew about them, and to assign an ACE score to each one of their young people, just based on the information that they knew. And you can see here we have 2 columns. So we have the Garda Youth Diversion Project one. So, you know, 4% of them had no ACEs. But when you look at the general population, that's 36%, and that's from an Irish study that we did. 4 or more ACEs, 63% of those young people had 4 or more ACEs. When you compare that to the general population, it's 12.5%. So the young people who were involved in juvenile justice were statistically more likely to have more ACEs. The only ones that were a little bit low in terms of comparing to the general population was sexual abuse. You can see there that was down at 8%. And we know from the literature and from practice that children don't often disclose childhood sexual abuse during childhood. So I would suspect that that's an underestimate here, and that these scores here are from adults. The other one that was a little bit low as well was exposure to domestic violence. And we also know that children can sometimes struggle to disclose that. Certainly that's something that's we're all concerned about at the moment in relation to COVID and the lockdown. And the World Health Organization is very concerned about the increase in domestic violence and children's exposure to parental alcohol dependence and the impact that that has on them. Silent Voices, which is a branch of Alcohol Action Ireland, are currently campaigning, you know, to have something more put in place in relation to protecting children and helping families, protecting children and helping families who are in situations like that. So another study that we did, which was moving away from kind of what we think about as sometimes marginalized groups. So we looked at a group of frontline service workers. So 576, Laura Lanigan, myself and Reagan Murphy looked at this. So we have 576 frontline workers. So that was Gardaí, probation officers, counsellors, psychologists, social workers, medical personnel, nurses, doctors, and paramedics. And what we asked them about was their socio-demographic information. We also asked them the ProQual, which is the Professional Quality of Life Scale, that measures secondary traumatic stress and burnout. And we also asked them about their early childhood experiences, and we used the 10-item Felici et al. Scale. One of the things we also asked was, how stressful was it for you to complete this survey on a scale of 0 to 10? With 0 being it wasn't at all emotionally difficult, and 10 out of 10 being it very difficult. I should also add, when we did the ACE, we've done that in every study that we've ever done. We always ask the service users how difficult it was for them to complete the ACE scale. So for example, in the Cork-Simon study, where the average ACE score was 7, when we asked them how difficult it was, the average difficulty rating in filling out that survey was 3 out of 10. So in terms of the frontline workers, what we learned was people who had stayed in their jobs for the longest period of time, so if somebody was in a role for 20 plus years, they tended to have lower ACEs. The lowest average ACE score was under 1, it was 0.85, and that was across the justice services. What was interesting though was they had the highest level of burnout. So ACEs were not connected to burnout there. The highest level of ACEs in terms of profession was across counsellors and therapists, with an average score of 3 across that. Scores did range from 0 to 10 in terms of respondents. Women scored higher on the ACE scale than men did, and they were more likely to report experiences of sexual violence. And then in terms of how difficult did people find it to fill out this scale, it was under 3, so it was around 2 out of 10 in terms of difficulty ratings, in terms of filling out that scale. So that's a very brief whistle-stop tour of some of the research that we've been doing in applied psychology in terms of ACEs. So I just want to spend a couple of minutes, talking now about the kind of critical questions in relation to ACEs. So the limitations of the ACE scale. So I suppose there are many, many different ACE scales. There was a good review done about 2 years ago. Nadine Burke-Harris was a co-author in a paper where they looked at about 16 different ACE scales and looked at what do they measure, are those ACE scales free to use, are they appropriate in different contexts. I suppose the most widely cited one is the Felici et al. Scale, which is the 10-item scale. And what's the limitation of that? The limitation of that is that it considers all of the adversity to occur within the context of the family. And while adversity does happen in families, adversity also happens in communities. And what we call structure level violence, which is policies and procedures in countries that make people impoverished and marginalized, people who cannot come out of poverty because the way in which societal structures are set up, means that they are more at risk for poor mental health. They are more at risk for substance dependence. And that is not an indication of any weakness on their part. It is actually an indication of how the societal structures are allowing people and not facilitating people to be able to move out of the situations that they're in. So in terms of the Felici et al. Scale, it only looks at adversity in the context of the family, and I think that that's problematic to lay all the blame in the family. You have to look at the wider context. So people talk about adverse childhood experiences and they talk about adverse community experiences. So poverty, violence, discrimination, all of those other things that we've spoken about. I have used the 10-item scale a lot in terms of the research. it was designed to be used for epidemiological research. It wasn't designed to be used as a screening tool in a clinical setting. It can help to tell us things in research, but I would not like to see a 10-item scale being used in a clinical setting if it's not taking into account the structures that family live within. The other thing that comes up a lot is you must not ask people about their ACEs. Anybody who does ACEs research will tell you about the conversations that they often have to have with ACE committees or with ethics committees, and it happens everywhere. People say, no, you can't ask that group of people about their adversity. And what was really interesting is, as somebody who has done that research, is that people are not upset when you ask those questions. You're asking them about their lived experiences in their lives. This is not new to them, that they've experienced this. And in terms of even the very first ACE study that I was involved in was with the Cork Simon community. And we collected qualitative feedback from the service users about what was it like to participate in the study and what was it like to be asked those questions. And the kind of responses they gave was, I remember one guy said, so I wasn't born a junkie. So it was his first time realizing that. And he said, I'm not a bad person. I've made bad choices. And a lot of that is to do with, things that have happened to me. And I broke my heart that this was a man in his 40s who experienced chronic homelessness and chronic addiction. And for the first time in his life, he was realizing that the situation that he'd ended up in was not because he was a bad person. It was because bad things had happened. So I don't think, and I think when you ask adults questions about their past and about their lives, if they don't want to tell you, they won't tell you. But I do hear it a lot as a criticism that you mustn't ask people about how shit their childhood was. They know exactly what it was. And one of the problems is that they've spent their whole life having to keep these things a secret. And if you look at the Alcohol Action Ireland Silent Voices website, the reason why it's called Silent Voices is because many people's voices are silent. And one of the ways that you empower people is by asking them about their experiences, and if they want to tell you, they will, and if they don't, they won't. Some people are criticizing the neuroscience and saying that it reduces people to, just their brain behavior. Anybody who works in psychology will know that psychologists mostly operate from a biopsychosocial model. So we recognize that all of those things are connected together. A lot of people are saying as well, oh, ACEs are the new buzzword, like mindfulness, etc., and that it's a fad and it will pass and those kind of things. For me, I think it's great that we're having these conversations about adversity and its impact on later life mental health, and that we've stopped reducing people to a set of behavioural symptoms. And children are challenging and children have behavioural issues. It's having these conversations mean that we can think about children and young people and adults in their whole context and look at their whole developmental pathway. Other people will say that, if you talk about ACEs, that what you're doing is you're labelling particularly disadvantaged and vulnerable communities, but actually ACEs happen in every single community. If you take alcohol dependence and its impact on children, that is not exclusive to any particular socioeconomic status. And, to say that, if you're a researcher and say, well, we can't talk about that, then you're taking away voices from people who are often very eager to share their stories or to understand the situations that they've ended up in. So I suppose one of the things that, and this is my last slide, is that when I think about adverse childhood experiences, and I think about young people who've experienced a lot of adversity and how they might present, and they might present as being perceived as challenging. One of the things I think about is why inclusion is important. And very often people who've experienced a lot of ACEs are excluded. They're excluded in their community. They're excluded from youth services and youth clubs and educational settings. And what we need to remember is one of the things that we learned when we were in first year psychology, and that was about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And if we want to work with people and work on their self-esteem and to be able to work on their strengths, then we have to meet their basic needs. And one of the things that they need to be able to work with us and to engage with us is they need to feel loved and they need to feel belonging. And there are lots of people in Ireland, in our communities, who don't feel that they belong, and they don't have a good time when they go to services. I have seen the way travellers are treated in lots of different services, and I've seen very small children from the travelling community being treated. When I think about my own children, when I bring them to services and the way that they are treated in services and how they are cared for and looked after, and I have been in services where my children are present and there are children from the travelling community, and the children from the travelling community do not receive the same sense of love and belonging from services that my children do. And that has a huge impact on small children. We have to meet children's basic needs. We have to keep them safe and secure. The earlier we do it, the better. And then, you know, if they do need to come to see us later on and use our services, we have to create services that are inclusive and that move beyond those things of thinking about challenging behaviour and asking why and what can I do and how could the service be better or how could the service be different so that it can meet the needs of the people who are coming to us. The people who need us the most are the people who find it hardest to access us, not because of them, but because of the way we've set our services up. So that's a very quick run through of some of the research that we've done. So I'm happy to take any questions.
So there's a chat button just at the bottom of all your screens if anyone wants to pop in any questions for Sharon. I don't know, can you see them, Sharon?
Yeah, I can see it, yeah. I can see, so somebody has put up a question saying, hi Sharon, can you talk more about trauma-informed approaches to rehabilitation in prisons? One of the things that was interesting in terms of the study that we did with frontline service providers was the fact that you had very low levels of ACEs in workers in justice systems, but very high levels of burnout. And I suppose we hypothesized actually was the fact that prison settings and justice settings are not very trauma informed. And if you have a system that's not trauma informed, that increases burnout for your workers. I suppose in terms of trauma informed, you have choice and collaboration, you have principles of trauma informed care. It can be difficult to implement them in justice settings because one of the things is choice and collaboration, and there's very little choice once you end up in a justice setting. Do I think it's possible? I absolutely think it's possible to have trauma-informed prison. I think that we need to think about prison as a place where people who have, there are a significant proportion of people in prison who have very, very complex and challenging physical needs, mental health needs, and social needs. And if we were to invest more resources into addressing those needs and doing it in a compassionate and kind way instead of a kind of a wholly justice way, I think that we would have a lot better outcomes. So there's just one here. Sorry. So how can challenging behaviour be reframed to promote more compassion in educational settings and services? I never ever use the word challenging behaviour. I just say, you know, I just say I just don't use it. I just say, I wonder why they're struggling. Why are they struggling? Or I notice that person is struggling. I wonder, you know, what it is that is so difficult for them. Given that sorry, I set my alarm. Given that the Garda Youth Diversion Project reports 74% of children with loss of a parent, can you comment on how the current pandemic and funeral restrictions might escalate this ACE due to the inherent exclusion or disenfranchisement? That's a really big question. Thank you, Tara. So the loss of a parent is hugely significant on children. And in the current pandemic, not being able to go to funerals is a massive issue. I don't know what the impact of that will be. You know, I know that people are doing a lot of research all the time in relation to the impact of COVID on issues. I don't think that we're going to know the true impact of that for at least 12 to 18 months, possibly 2 years, because it's very difficult to know the impact when we're in the middle of it. Sorry, I'm a little bit slower at the reading. So somebody who wants information in relation to trauma-informed schools, I would say email me. I can send you loads of resources about that, because if I started talking about that, I'd be here for ages. Teachers' knowledge of ACEs. Yeah. So somebody wanting to know about teachers. So it does surprise me when I think about teacher training, about the lack of kind of psychological input into the teacher training. So in terms of, when I think about it, when you drop your children off at school in the morning, you're handing them over. My children, when I'm at work, my children spend more time in the care of teachers than they do with me. So teachers are actually acting in loco parentis. You know, teachers can affect a lifetime, they can affect an eternity. And so if you have teachers who are going in and they're going into a school where you have loads of children who are presenting with challenging behaviour, and they don't have the theoretical information behind that, I think it must be extremely difficult to be able to manage that and to understand it. We actually looked at, in a separate study, it wasn't related to ACEs, but actually we looked at stress levels in teachers a good few years ago, and it was extremely high, and a lot of the stuff that they were reporting was in relation to increases in managing children's mental health and not understanding. Teachers for me are huge, because I think sometimes when we think about children who are experiencing adversity and trauma, we think about, oh, we have to get them to a psychologist and, you know, this high level interventions. But we actually know that the one good adult model is a really good model for having a huge impact on children very early on, and teachers can be that one good adult. So for the teachers who do understand ACEs and do understand where this behaviour is coming from, when they tune into that and they connect with that kid, and they love them unconditionally, despite the fact that sometimes the child challenges that, that can have a much bigger impact on children's outcomes than actually getting them to any kind of specialist, because most children just need one safe adult that makes them feel special and loves them unconditionally. And I do think that it would be really important for schools and for teachers in particular to have training in ACEs. And it would be, it's easy to make a place trauma-informed. Mostly what's required to become a trauma-informed organisation is a cultural shift. So if you can get the people that you work with behind you, you can actually become trauma-aware or trauma-responsive or trauma-informed. So somebody wants to know about a measure for capturing familial impact on ACEs as well as societal communal factors. And the World Health Organization has its own ACE scale, and they record things like the familial issues, but they also record things like exposure to community violence, exposure to bullying, the experiences of being a refugee and an immigrant. It does capture slightly more than the 10-item scale. For me, there isn't a perfect one that exists yet. So hopefully in the next couple of years, there will be one that is more robust, that captures what we know from research. So, for example, one of the things that we know is that children who've had very complex medical issues early on, that can have a huge impact on mental health issues later in life, and that's often not recorded as an ACE either. So the place in Canada I talked about was actually a homelessness shelter. And what they did in the homelessness shelter was they built a hospital in the homeless shelter, a small hospital, where they were able to meet the physical and mental health needs of their service users. because this is moving faster than I can think. I don't know if I've answered all of the questions.
There's just one more here from Orla Sharon. She asked, have you conducted much research specifically around intergenerational trauma, or can you recommend any resources worth looking at this at the moment?
I haven't done any. I think it's an interesting. It would be an interesting area to research. The thing is that it's very difficult to research because it's often the stuff that we have that we don't know we have. So if you go back to the example I gave, the escalator story, I would not have known that that was not my story, that it was actually my grandmother's story, but for the fact that I happened to, a coincidence that happened to occur in front of my mother. And I know that when I worked with young people in the past in the community, it was, really interesting to see how you could see things being played out. But there are certain, if you look at family systems theory, that will, what is the word I'm looking for? Family systems theory, and it has completely gone from my mind. Again, email me and I will see if I can dig up the stuff I have, Orla.
And I think there was one you missed from Georgina. She asked, for an adult that has codependency issues, what sort of treatments would you recommend? And also if you could give a definition of a codependent person, or codependent people.
So that's a word that's used in the addiction services. And I suppose it's not really a term that I there's lots of terms that I'm uncomfortable with. And that would be one of them. Because in terms of codependency, it's breaking down something that's very complicated into two words. And for me, when there are issues in terms of codependency issues, those issues occur in the context of the family. And dealing with issues in the context of the family is always the best way that you can deal with it if you can. Families are a system. When problems happen in the system, it affects the whole system. And in order to have the best outcomes, it's better to address the whole system. If there's one thing I would love is that when children are referred to any service, that rather than focusing on the child's bad behaviour or the child's difficult and challenging behaviour, that we actually look at the family and support the family to be the best that they can be, so that the adults in that family can support the children in the best way that they can.
There's just a couple of comments there for yourself. I don't think there's any more questions.
Brilliant. Okay, so look, it's not a great time of the evening for people to be, doing this, because you probably want to be having your dinner. And my children are currently locked in a tent in the garage with a laptop, not in the garage, in the garden, so that they won't interrupt me. So thank you to everybody. Like, there's a lot of people, dialed in this evening. So thank you to you for taking the time to do that. And it's kind of 5 years of the work that I've been doing in the space of 50 minutes. So it's hard to cover everything I'd like to say. So I just want to say that if anybody has any extra questions that I didn't answer, my email address is sharon.lambert@ucc.ie. I'm very happy to send people any resources that they want. Very happy to share the PowerPoint slide or any papers that I have. And if anybody was impacted by any of the things that I was talking about in tonight's presentation, just please email me. And if I can direct you in the right place, I will. And thank you, of course, to Chelsea and Niamh and all of the other amazing people at the PSI in your 50th birthday for all of the events that you've been running this year. So thank you to everybody. And I will now go back to my normal lockdown attire, which is pajamas. So I hope you appreciate that I brushed my hair for you all this evening.
And I just want to say a big thank you, Sharon, on behalf of the Early Graduate Group, for taking the time out to do this for us this evening. It was great. And
okay, thank you.
So thank you.
Okay, bye. Bye.